Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We will get started very shortly. I'm Rebecca Hubbard, Program Director with Overfish, co-host of this event, Mobilising Ocean Climate Action. We're co-hosting with Maastricht and the Maastricht University, and we appreciate you all joining us. So we might get started, although it's still a bit early and we expect quite a lot more people to join us, but we'll start here for now. This evening we have a really fantastic and interesting panel of expert speakers. First of all, have Dr. Alex Rogers, the Science Director at Rev Ocean and Visiting Professor at Oxford University. Alex has worked across the Atlantic, Indian and Southern Oceans and the Caribbean, investigating coral reef ecosystems, seamounts and deep sea hydrothermal vents. Science Director at Rev Ocean, a foundation aimed at finding solutions to problems affecting the ocean, and Visiting Professor at the Department of Zoology, University of Oxford. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Rogers. We also have Ms. Veronica Manfredi, the Director of Directorate C, or otherwise known as the Quality of Life for the Directorate General of the Environment at the European Commission. A lawyer by background, Veronica's Directorate plays a key role in leading Europe towards zero pollution and securing an effective management of water, and significantly contributes to tackle the climate, biodiversity and circular economy challenges. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Manfredi. From our climate activist background, we have Friederike Leppert from Maastricht. Friederike is a climate activist from Germany who currently studies international politics at the University College Maastricht. As a climate activist, she's concerned about the insufficient and sometimes counterproductive political actions. Thanks so much for joining us, Friederike. And last but not least, Dr. Francesca Colli, Assistant Professor of European Politics at the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at Maastricht University. Previously a substitute lecturer at the Leuven International and European Studies Institute, and also an Associate Research Fellow at Emont Institute, Brussels. Dr. Colli's interests include the role and lobbying activities of interest groups and social movements on national and EU policy, particularly on environmental and climate change policies. So thank you so much to our esteemed panel for joining. In terms of the way that we're going to progress with this webinar, we're going to hear from Dr. Rogers to begin with, the 10-minute presentation on the carbon cycle, life in the ocean and climate mitigation, so that everybody has a kind of basic understanding, or at least the basic facts around how the ocean contributes to the climate and the carbon cycle. And then we have a number of questions that we've already received from registrants and that we will be asking the panelists, and we will be having a bit of a conversation around some of these questions. But if you have a question that is burning, please do add it to the Q&A section. So rather than put it in the chat, pop it in the Q&A. So as you can see there, if you put a question in there, other people can vote on it. So any very pressing questions, or questions that you support that you want to see answered from someone else, if you vote for that, the more votes and the higher up it goes, the more likely we are to answer it or to list it during the webinar. And we will be filming the webinar, so we'll have a recording of it made available at the end of the event. So just a quick mention that for the best 5 questions that are asked during the webinar, particularly for the Owlfish supporters, you go in the running to win a campaign towel. So if you have a really great question, that's a little bit of an extra motivator for you to ask it. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Rogers, and he can run us through the carbon cycle, life in the ocean, and climate mitigation. Thanks, Dr. Rogers.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you to everyone who's attending and my fellow panelists as well. I'll just try and share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Can you see that?
It says that yes.
Yes, jolly good. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about the carbon cycle, life in the ocean and climate mitigation as part of this Mobilising Ocean Climate Action webinar. So the first question I thought I would answer in this was obviously, what is blue carbon? Well, essentially, these are marine ecosystems that sequester and store carbon with a significant impact on carbon dioxide levels. This means that this storage must be over long time scales. So we're talking about hundreds of years to thousands of years to be relevant to the current climate emergency. It must be influenced by human intervention. Things like fishing methods or aquaculture approaches and so on. And it's important to consider also the kind of negative impacts of human activities, such as the losses of ecosystems and biodiversity that don't simply stop taking up carbon dioxide, but actually result in the release of CO2 into the atmosphere. So far, much of the discussion around blue carbon has been around coastal ecosystems. So things like mangrove forests, salt marshes, seagrass beds, and other ecosystems like mudflats and so on. And we look at carbon in these systems by looking at the living biomass above ground. So in the case of mangrove forests, the trees that you actually see on the photograph here, but also, and in fact, more importantly, in some of these ecosystems, the living biomass and the trapped organic carbon, which is actually below ground, because many of these ecosystems act to trap particles of organic carbon that flow through them. Of these ecosystems, mangrove forests, salt marshes, and seagrass beds have been looked at the most. Kelp forests also are thought to sequester carbon, but little of that carbon is retained in situ. And of course, they don't trap carbon in sediment associated with those actual ecosystems, or at least not a great deal. But I'll come back to algal forests later, as they may be much more important than previously recognized. So how much carbon do these ecosystems take up? Well, here are the numbers, and this is probably a little bit bewildering, but a teragram is about 10 to the 12 grams, or a megaton. So you see here mangrove forests, it's been estimated anywhere between 17 to 34 megatons of carbon, organic carbon per year. And they store carbon stocks of 5 to 20 petagrams, that's billion tons of carbon within those ecosystems distributed globally. But you also see here that we're still losing these ecosystems, and that means that there is a CO2 release as a result of those lost processes. And you see here for mangroves, that's in the order of 0.09 to 0.68 billion tons of carbon CO2 equivalents per annum. So at current rates of habitat destruction, we're losing nearly half a gigaton of carbon per year, or half a billion tons of carbon per year as a result of this ecosystem destruction process. Well, recently we've realized that in fact carbon is being sequestered over much wider areas of the ocean. And one of the first examples of this was a consideration of whales and what they do in terms of carbon sequestration. So the first thing that whales do, like all living things, or certainly all of them that we know about, is die. And as a result, those dead bodies, or some of them, end up falling to the seabed, and the carbon associated with them is stored, particularly when that whale dies over the deep ocean. So when it falls below 1,000 meters, that carbon is potentially tied up for hundreds or thousands of years. Now, there's also some other processes that whales are involved in that may have some impact on carbon sequestration. And here is just one example where sperm whales are thought to export something like 50 tons of iron from the deep ocean in the Southern Ocean to the surface, stimulating primary production and increasing the carbon sink by 200,000 tons a year. Now, the reason that this happens is because, of course, the Southern Ocean is limited in terms of its surface primary production by the micronutrient iron. So when the whales defecate in surface waters, as you can see these whales doing in the picture, they're actually releasing iron that they've obtained from their diet, which is actually mainly in the form of squid and other organisms they fed on in the deep sea. Now, to counter this, marine mammal respiration may actually reduce some aspects of the efficiency of the biological carbon pump. But we do think that certainly locally, this can be quite an important process in terms of carbon sequestration. But of course, it's dwarfed by those coastal ecosystems that I spoke about earlier. So we have whale carbon, which basically comes from the dying of whales, but also these effects of transport of nutrients like iron. Other nutrients are also thought to be transported by whales and may have been important in other parts of the world prior to the killing off of populations of whales through whaling. However, there are many, many other processes that we're discovering that may be extremely important in terms of transport of carbon into the ocean interior. So as opposed to passive sinking of phytoplankton and other organic material into the ocean, active transport of carbon is where there is some sort of mechanism which is actively pumping or transporting carbon into the ocean interior. And one particularly important one, we think, is twilight zone carbon, where you have this enormous migration of animals from the deep ocean up to the surface at night where they feed. And then as the day breaks, those animals dive back into the deep ocean, transporting carbon down into the ocean interior. So following that, we need to consider whether humans can actually affect some of these carbon transport and sequestration processes. And the simple answer to that is yes. So certainly we know that climate change is having impacts on the ocean. It's potentially reducing overall surface primary production, mainly because of an increased stratification of the ocean, which reduces nutrient availability to surface water layers. It also affects the size and productivity of fish populations and causes loss of habitat. In other words, loss of some of these carbon sinks that we know about. And there are many other effects of climate change which need to be considered here as well. Fishing, of course, involves a reduction of biomass of populations of target and bycatch species. So it potentially reduces the active transport of carbon. Also, some fishing methods damage the environment, potentially releasing carbon, and that includes things like bottom trawling, which I'll come to in a moment. There's also the bycatch of ocean predators, which affect ecosystem structure, and of course, what I've already mentioned, the destruction of habitats. And we might also think about other industrial processes in the ocean, such as dredging and potentially seafloor mining, and also the effect of things like pollution, such as from marine debris, but also chemical pollutants as well. So just to home in on one of these things, there was some recent work done by Henri Saller and company earlier this year, as published in Nature, where they looked at the effects of bottom trawling on sediment resuspension and release of carbon dioxide. And they worked on the premise that about 4.9 million square kilometers of the seafloor is trawled every year. This is about 1.3% of the ocean floor. And they estimated that about 1.47 petagrams of CO2, of increased CO2 emissions occurs as a result of release of this carbon from the sediment and increased carbon metabolism, which is a really quite an astonishing figure. This emission figure actually drops as years go by, as essentially repeated trawling ends up burning up that carbon in the sediment. But even so, these are really huge numbers. Also homing in on what I mentioned earlier, the carbon sequestration through active transport in the twilight zone. It's estimated now there's something like 10 to 15 billion tons of biomass in the twilight zone. This is the zone between 200 to 1,000 meters or more in the water column out in the oceans. And it actively transports something like 900 to 3,500 teragrams of organic carbon per year. So you can see this number actually dwarfs some of these coastal blue carbon ecosystems that we looked at earlier. So even taking a small percentage of mesopelagic fish biomass through fishing, which is something several countries around the world are looking at the moment, may result in a globally significant loss of CO2 sequestration capacity. Also, I thought I would just mention briefly macroalgae as the kind of coastal blue carbon ecosystem that's largely been ignored up to the last few years. And it's just worth noting that these kelp forests cover something like 4.3 million square kilometers of the seafloor. And although they do not sequester carbon in situ, what happens is that, of course, pieces of that algae get broken off and exported to other ecosystems or dissolved or broken up into smaller and smaller particles. So it's been estimated that as a result of the growth of these seaweed beds, there's sequestration of somewhere between 61 to 268 teragrams of carbon per annum. And of course, this immediately brings to mind the potential of algal aquaculture to actually supplement these natural ecosystems in terms of carbon sequestration, because it's been estimated that a certain percentage of the algae grown in these macroalgal farms is also lost to the environment and sequestered to other ecosystems. So there's a potential of something like 48 million square kilometers that could be farmed from macroalgae, but of course only a small fraction of this is likely to be used for various reasons. But this does mean that algal aquaculture does have quite a high potential for carbon sequestration. So just to summarize all that, coastal blue carbon is now recognized as a potentially certifiable mechanism of carbon sequestration, particularly mangrove salt marshes and seagrasses. Algae, we're still trying to get a grip of the numbers. Oceanic blue carbon has enormous potential and is clearly impacted by human activities. There's a large need for research to really understand the mechanisms and to quantify the amounts of carbon sequestered through these various pathways. And ocean management, including of fisheries, can reduce direct emissions, such as fuel use by fishing vessels, but also indirect emissions from destruction of blue carbon habitats. And finally, understanding of sequestration by seaweeds is increasing, and seaweed farming itself may become a certifiable way of sequestering carbon. And that's all I'd like to say for now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dr. Rogers. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. I think that gives everybody a really good baseline of information to work with. So just to start off, so all of the panelists have their cameras on. Excellent. I've got I thought perhaps we could start with Friederike, coming off the back of Dr. Rogers' presentation. So Maastricht is a really active climate group, relatively close to the sea, because everything is close to the sea in the Netherlands, and engaged in a lot of, on the ground action. Do you think many people concerned about the climate crisis know about blue carbon and the potential contribution that the ocean has to make?
I think that the awareness is limited, to be honest. And I grew up and became a climate activist in Hamburg in Germany, so even closer to the sea and the city with a large port. And even there, the awareness was not fully there. And I think this is that although the ocean makes up such a huge part of our ecosystem, it does not really make for a part in our everyday life. Unless, I guess, this is your job, you might only just see the river running through your city and every day, but that's about as close as it gets. Some of us, including me, might have had a fish pond or an aquarium in the past, so maybe there we've experienced how difficult it can actually be to balance such an ecosystem of water. I remember a friend from school had this fish pond in the garden, and it was just so difficult for them to keep a balance, although it was all out in nature. And so it was difficult already for them to sustain the different forms of life in this pond. And the oceans are already so much larger, and that means the ecosystem is so much more complex, which I just think makes it so much difficult to create or solve any problem that may occur, because it's so complex, and that makes it difficult for individuals to also feel like they are responsible or they can do much about this issue and about using the ocean as a source to mitigate climate change.
And who do you think the most important people are to know about this information? I mean, in terms of responding.
I must say one reason why I think we were so happy to co-host this panel as Can Maastricht, and why I'm so happy to be a panelist, because it's exactly politicians, it's exactly the EU who are so essential in regulating this in cooperation with experts like Dr. Alex Rogers, but as well as in communication with all the companies, the corporations who are there. But mostly, I think it's politicians at this point who need to help us to use all of the potential that we have.
Yeah, so this is why it's fabulous to have Ms. Manfredi with us, and we'll come to you in just a minute. But Dr. Colli, with your area of expertise especially, who do you think the most important stakeholders are, and what role do you think science plays, and to what extent this is challenged or overridden by lobbyists?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, for those who aren't familiar with EU politics, like any political system, all proposals that are made by the Commission are basically debated by different institutions. So in the EU, the main institutional stakeholders, I'd say, would be the Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council, which is basically the member states. And what makes it tricky in the EU is that all the member states, all the countries have different interests. And so, of course, when we talk about the ocean, there are some member states that are very close to the ocean, as we've already alluded to. And then there are those that have little to no fishing as part of their economy. And so that makes, I think, negotiations also more complex. So of course, the main industrial kind of stakeholders are the fishing industry. And we also have like environmental NGOs like Outfish and other NGOs like WWF that are working on this a lot. And there I'd say, I'd agree with Friederike that probably a challenge is that people don't know that much about blue carbon, and the debate is very much more about biodiversity, which is of course very strongly linked, but not really the same as necessary climate mitigation. In terms of science, I think this is of course at the basis of, most of the EU's environmental and climate politics. But I think the issue is that because of these complex negotiations, it inevitably gets watered down or changed with other economic and social considerations as well. And of course, lobbying also takes place before the Commission does a proposal, because if you can get something taken out or included in the proposal, it's a lot harder to change actually afterwards in the debate itself. So yeah, of course, regulations are often watered down by industry or by countries or regions that have a particular stake. But I would also maybe nuance it and say that the proposal might also change because of legitimate concerns. So for instance, with fishing industry, there are many communities that are very dependent on this. And so if you are going to make big changes, maybe what the science says is necessary might need to be kind of nuanced by social concerns, what we call like the just transition, making sure that these communities aren't adversely affected by kind of changes that are only taking one perspective into account as well. So I don't think that should be an excuse for inaction, but to say that lobbying can come from different sides and isn't necessarily always a bad thing, full stop, and can be useful to remind us of kind of the social consequences of policy as well.
Yeah, great. Ms. Manfredi, I think that you probably have something to say about this process as well, but I really feel like it integrates into all of your work. So I'm really happy for you to comment on that maybe in just a moment. Before we come to you, I just think, Dr. Rogers, one of the things that was asked by the supporters in advance, and I think you touched on it in your presentation, but if you could just give a little bit more information, one of the big questions was, what is the greatest threat to the oceans? And by minimizing that threat, how much of an impact can we have on a healthy ocean's capacity to mitigate climate change?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Rebecca, and obviously it kind of, partially hinges on what you're talking about in terms of what's being threatened. If it's marine biodiversity, then the biggest threat by a long mile is overfishing and the destructive effects of fishing, followed up by habitat destruction, and then the rather lengthening list of other things like pollution, ocean plastics, invasive species, and so on. Climate change itself is a growing threat to all marine life, and as I alluded to in the talk, also to the processes which are involved in carbon sequestration. So anything which impacts on primary productivity in the ocean is going to impact on that carbon sequestration process overall. One of the effects of climate change we know about is this effect of increasing stratification of the ocean. So in other words, warming of the surface ocean is reducing mixing of the surface layers with deeper layers, and as a result, reducing mixing of nutrients into shallow layers, particularly in temperate latitudes. And that reduction in primary production that results means less carbon going into the deep sea. Now that is countered to some extent by other climate processes, such as basically loss of sea ice at the poles, which exposes more ocean surface which allows algae to grow. But those kind of processes which are countering that reduction in primary production are not at the same orders of magnitude at the moment. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, activities like fishing and so on have effects through both the direct removal of biomass, but also habitat destruction. And as we've seen, when you lose habitats like mangrove forests, seagrass beds and so on, not only does sequestration stop in terms of the ecosystem that's lost, but you actually get release of the CO2 that's stored in the sediments below and so on.
So not a really simple response then, Dr. Rogers.
No, sorry about that. I mean, none of this is simple. And to be quite frank, you know, the whole question about carbon sequestration in the open ocean is extremely complex. And, you know, us scientists are only really getting to grips with some of how this works. Now, I'll give you an idea of just how big the knowledge gap is. It was only in 2015, so 5-6 years ago, that a rather clever scientist, I think from Norway, put an echo sounder over the nets they were using to sample midwater fish, and figured out that 90% of the fish were swimming out of the way of the net, which meant that they'd underestimated the biomass of midwater fish by an order of magnitude or more. So, you know, one scientific paper can completely change the face of our understanding of this problem.
And this issue definitely has seen an enormous amount of scientific research and questions and answers just in the last couple of years that we've been working on it. And I'm sure people who've been working on it for longer have seen even more rapid evolution. So right now in the EU, fisheries are essentially managed mostly by single species fishing limits, at least in the Northeast Atlantic. The Mediterranean is a slightly different situation, but that means that the impacts on other parts of the ecosystem and the carbon cycle, such as from bottom trawling, are not necessarily managed as well. Now, I'm sure that, that some people might, you know, like to, you know, debate the detail of that, but essentially we are really relying on these annual fishing limits as our main management tool. As well, the main policy for fisheries, which was updated in 2013, the Common Fisheries Policy, doesn't even mention the word climate change, which is kind of staggering in some ways, right? But linked to the European Green Deal, the EU Commission committed to developing an action plan to protect fisheries resources and marine ecosystems as part of their EU biodiversity strategy for 2030. So, Ms. Manfredi, for you, how can the Commission, or what will the Commission do to use this opportunity of the action plan to outline a plan of ocean climate action? And, you know, what could be in this action plan that could really start to address ocean climate action and fill that gap?
First of all, let me thank you really wholeheartedly, all of you, for organizing this panel, and a special thank actually to Dr. Rogers, because I think in his presentation, and he just repeated it again, made it very, very clear how much the science is evolving in these years. I must tell you, very personally, I'm the director in charge of this department since 2018, that we have seen ourselves such an evolution in terms of news reaching us about the impact of, in particular, for example, carbon sequestration and bottom trawling, which are rather recent. And you are perfectly correct in stating that it's fascinating to see the certain pieces of EU law, and you mentioned the Common Fishery Policy, but I would also add that the Marine Strategy Framework Directive are relatively silent on the aspect of climate change, because at the times they were conceived, Marine Strategy Framework Directive dates back to 2008, the knowledge was much, much poorer. So we were doing something extremely novel that we must continue to do, which is protecting the marine ecosystems. But I think we all collectively underestimated how much doing that is really protecting these famous planetary boundaries. And allow me also to add, when we came up with the Zero Pollution Action Plan, the first criticism by some stakeholders was zero pollution. What do you mean? It's impossible. But actually what Dr. Rogers has been explaining to us, that for centuries, even including the Industrial Revolution, mankind has been able to pollute, to some extent. It's implicit, I would say, to the fact that we grow, we produce, etc. But we never had overcome those planetary boundaries, and the ocean is helping us daily to such an incredible extent. I always like to repeat, every second breath we take comes from the oxygen of the oceans. So this is the paradox. Friederike was saying the oceans is far away, yet every second breath of oxygen comes from there. And for centuries, mankind has been able to grow, produce, transport, etc., without having this major impact. Now, in 40 years, we have managed to distract 60% of our biodiversity richness. So it shows that really there is a trying to be reversed, and very, very quickly, but that we've also introduced very, very quickly. So we have to be as fast in reversing the trend as we have been in introducing it. What can we do? So I would say there are actually several strands, not just the action plan to which you refer, Mrs. Leppert, that are important. Per se, the EU biodiversity strategy is a game changer, because it is not only the strategy directing what we have to do inside the European Union, there where we have said that by 2030, we want to secure that 30% of our oceans and seas are protected. And out of those, 1/3 to be strictly protected. It means no fishing activities at all. This is really a game changer, also to the extent the same strategy is progressively being pushed at European level. You know that 2021 is the year where we kick off the COP on biodiversity in Kunming. Actually, we'll have it in 2 segments, as you may know. The second one will take place in April, but I must say we are gathering increasing consensus. And what is also very interesting to note in the international scene is that there is there as well at policy makers level. We have seen it even at the EUCN event in Marseille, where our leaders went. We had a really important declaration from President Charles Michel, President Macron, etc. We are connecting eventually the dots between biodiversity loss and climate impacts. So what can we do? Delivering on biodiversity, indeed securing that this action plan on fishery, conservation of fishery resources and marine quantifies as well as possible, integrates as well as possible the level of science that we know, but also create the hooks that we need to continue financing the knowledge gaps, which are still pretty big, of which we are aware. And this is why you will find in Starfish mission, the Horizon Europe mission dedicated to oceans and fresh waters. We are discussing oceans today, but as you know, we have similar issues of better quantification of carbon sequestration also of our rivers and lakes. We have to continue finance innovative research to be able to quantify all this better. But allow me to say one final remark. We must secure that nature is our ally in getting, climate mitigation right and adapt better. But in no way the efforts done to restore nature should be seen as a pretext to relent the efforts to be done for industrial processes, energy production processes, and others. We need everything all together. So yes, to restore nature, yes, to continue also changing all the industrial processes behind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Manfredi. I actually have a question right back, because you mentioned all these great big plans, and I think they are great, but unfortunately, so far I've really missed the point on achieving them and getting there. So I want to ask on something smaller, but very concrete. You're still subsidizing the fuel through a tax subsidy for fishery. Is that going to end? Because this would be a concrete step, and concrete steps is also what we really need now.
So first of all, these aspects are all being reviewed in the framework of the ongoing revision of the Energy Taxation Directive. I'm not in a position to tell you now, yes, we will do it, because as you know, this is all the result of collegial decisions. But I can tell you that these things are very much in our radar screen as it needs to be. And we have to always assess, the benefits, the environmental benefits that we get out of driving the entire, not just fishing vessels, but the entire maritime transport towards cleaner fuels versus socioeconomic impacts. But I think the drive is pretty big, as you might have seen also from the announcement made in the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy. And very, very concretely, as we speak, there is, for example, a very important meeting ongoing in one of our regional sea conventions in the entire North Atlantic Sea, where all the contracting parties are discussing the possibility to establish a big, one of the largest marine protected areas. So it's not just words, it's progressive action that is transforming, itself into facts and figures. But we need everyone to help us as well, because we know since years we have designated other marine protected areas in the past, and yet they remained a little bit these, paper parks, as we call them. So if the management is not good, if the control and enforcement systems are not good, you don't achieve the progress that you wish. So we are also working towards improving this. And this is why, for example, the ongoing public consultation on the possible revision of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive plays for us a very important role. 2023 will be an important year for further progress in this area. So please help us to change things. I was going to say on the ground, this time is on the sea.
You are talking of help. What exact help are you expecting? And of which parts of society? Is it me as an individual? Is it NGOs like Our Fish, or scientists like Dr. Alex Rogers and Dr. Francesca Colli?
NGOs, for example, are extremely important for us when it comes to the management of marine protected areas. In a number of cases of good practices that we see in member states, we see that the fact that there has been a very close involvement of good, well-organized NGOs together with the local authorities has really secured the difference. Plus, they play an important role in raising the awareness. This is really, for us, is a super important game changer. I need the scientists for sure, because without people like Dr. Rogers, like Dr. Colli, that are really helping us in putting facts and figures which are convincing and provide the evidence, we cannot advance. So that's why I'm saying I really need literally everyone. I need the regional authorities, local authorities on board. Everyone is needed. And I think we are creating governance setting to enable everyone to have a role. When it comes with engagement with the younger generation, you may know that in Glasgow, at the beginning of November, we will have the stock taking of the Climate Pact and the launch of a specific peer parliament to really engage with a broad range of youth movement to secure a constant grip and acceleration of the climate change movement. But at the same time, we're also pouring a lot of money, you will have seen under the new MFF, into research, science, devoted precisely to tackling the hottest environmental and climate challenges of this decade.
You're muted, Rebecca.
Thanks. So I think this is really a fascinating crunch point, because we both have new science that's coming really, really fast, but we also have insane climate change and biodiversity loss that has been happening for hundreds of years, really, and is increasingly, certainly in the last tens of years, is just becoming increasingly accelerated and putting extra pressure on the action, but also on the decision-making processes of politics. So it's becoming, it really develops this real conflict area, or this real challenge. And just developing on what Friederike was mentioning before around fuel tax subsidies. So, the EU has the capacity to eliminate all fuel tax subsidies for the fishing industry, which, we estimated were up to €1.5 billion a year for the EU fishing fleet. But at the same level, the EU could be fighting for that position at the WTO as well, internationally, so that all countries are on a level playing field. And we can see that like the fishing industry, as every one of us needs to contribute to climate mitigation and climate action, right? We all need to do every single thing we can now, because as I think it was Ms. Inga Anderson from the UN said, you know, every ton of CO2 counts right now. So with that in mind, anyway, I mean, and following on from that, the EU is developing this whole range, or updating a whole range of regulation as part of, in response to the climate law and in trying to get to climate neutrality. And as Friederike said, you know, there's these great commitments, but then when it comes to the draft presentations and regulations that are being developed, they're kind of falling a little bit short. And one of these was, you know, another one of these beyond the Energy Taxation Directive review is looking at carbon accounting. So for those climate geeks, it's the LULUCF. But for those of us who aren't climate geeks, it's about reporting and accounting for carbon, such as in forests or farms and land use. And at the moment, it doesn't include the ocean at all. And it even suggests that you couldn't start to look at ocean carbon stores until, I think, 2023. So, Dr. Rogers, do you think that the European Commission should propose legislation that enables ocean carbon reporting sooner and actually starts to kind of urge to push that to happen? Because if you don't count the carbon stores, they don't count, right? If you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do think that should happen, and I think an immediate result of that would be to push the science effectively to deliver the information that's really needed in terms of how effective those ocean carbon sequestration systems may be, and how different forms of human activity might disrupt them. So I would certainly be a fan of pushing things forward as fast as possible, given the speed of climate change and the speed of biodiversity loss in the ocean. There isn't a moment to lose.
That mute button. Dr. Colli, how effective do you think this legislation actually can be? You know, there's been a little bit of a comment of, can this Fit for 55 package, or these reviewed legislations, can they deliver on the ambition that we're looking for?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of making predictions because they are usually wrong. So I'm not going to say whether it will be effective or not. I would say I think that Fit for 55 and the whole like Green Deal in general is really ambitious. And if it were to pass and become law the way it is now, I think it could be really effective. The likelihood is that it's going to change, you know, as it goes through negotiations, because I mean, the LULUCF is also at the moment still in proposal stage. It still needs to be negotiated. Compromises are always made. So I think it will undoubtedly change, and that will obviously affect how effective it can be. And also, as Ms. Manfredi was saying before, I think the regulation then needs to actually be enforced. And in environmental policy in particular, this is usually the stumbling block. Like, it's very easy to set targets and to say, you know, for the member states in particular, say, yes, we're going to protect this area, or we're going to set this emissions reduction target, this mitigation target. But it has one of the highest infringement rates in all policies in the EU, basically. So if the regulation does turn out to be great, but then isn't enforced, then it also loses effectiveness. So I think these are the two kind of key points where it might go awry, let's say. And that's why I'm not making any predictions today. So
it's safer that way. So something that a couple of people have asked is, how do we use the very excellent information that Dr. Rogers has provided to strengthen the protection of marine life and to and even to amplify the information of Dr. Rogers and other scientists in this area, to ensure that this message is carried and that it can cut through and actually influence the drafting of that legislation, as you said, Dr. Colli, but also then carry through the process of negotiation and come out the other end with a legislation that does actually address this crisis that we're dealing with? That's a question to all of you. So you get to answer, whoever jumps in first gets to answer.
I guess I'll just do my duty as a climate activist and say, I think at this point, that is where we as individuals can come in. I think especially like on Friday, we've seen huge climate strikes everywhere, specifically in Germany, because we just had elections with over 600,000 people on the streets. And I think this can be an effective way to not only influence how people think and bring awareness to the issue, but this can also put a pressure on regional authorities to change the way that they are acting, and hopefully also bring more pressure to the EU to resist lobbying of some groups to make this legislation as effective as possible, and to bring the legislation that we need through and enforce it as well, which I think is a huge problem at the moment from my perspective.
Thanks, Friederike. Dr. Rogers?
Well, there are two things which I think would help. One is to bring other forms of expertise into the fisheries management organisations. So ecosystem-based expertise in climate impacts from fishing and so on. If you look at things like regional fisheries management organisations, of which Europe are members in many parts of the world, they have almost no expertise in terms of these wider impacts of fishing. That really has to change, and the mandate of these organisations has to be updated to a modern ecosystem, climate, biodiversity perspective. The other thing is public engagement. I mean, the public are just not aware of the role of the ocean in terms of the climate. They're not aware of the actions that are done on their behalf, and the actions which they are part of have a negative impact on the ocean. And engagement of citizens in science, for example, in policy, I think could be a really important part of this jigsaw puzzle.
Great. Ms. Manfredi, did you want to comment on that?
Thank you. Yes, first of all, I think that science also needs to speak to science. So it's very important that indeed we are fully aware of latest developments, also through the channels of cooperation within Horizon Europe, partnerships, innovation, Mission Ocean, etc., etc. But I fully agree with what Dr. Rogers said. I think that often the missing link is the capacity to translate all this knowledge into something that becomes a very powerful narrative. And a very simple thing that comes to my mind, bottom trawling. How much do we as eaters of fish, I'm not a very big eater of fish, I'm saying, but okay, I respect many of us are aware of which type of fish are bottom trawled and what is the environmental impact that comes with eating certain fish versus another. I think really if you were to launch a Eurobarometer on that, the replies will be extremely poor. So important to translate this into something practical that can also change the awareness and then hopefully the behaviors. And at the same time, honestly, we also need a proper vision for a transformation of the fishery practices as such. And also, which fisheries are we talking about? I think that the biggest damage comes from the largest, I would say, industrial-based type of activities rather than the small-scale one. So it's also important that the science help us to understand concretely from where do the damages come, because this then allows the policymakers to be more targeted in their interventions and here comes maybe also the role of Earth observation. We are in the digital era. We know, I mean, they track us with our smartphone about where we go. I know that we can follow the flow of a whale. Can't we really be more precise in understanding where the big pressure comes from which type of actors, so that the policy measures are really targeted and do not necessarily create major socioeconomic imbalances? these would be some of my key reflections. And on the enforcement, I fully agree with previous speakers. I think this is really our biggest challenge for across the environmental law. And we're aware and we're working on that.
Thank you. Dr. Colli, did you want to comment?
No, I think I just wanted to add, I think that we shouldn't underestimate the power of, like, for example, it's stupid, but even Seaspiracy, which is not specifically about climate change and also was flawed in many ways, but having like a documentary that raises public awareness can really make a spike in the number of people who care about the issue. Then I think the challenge for NGOs and for like activists is to keep that public awareness, the public attention a little bit high, because I think many people watched it, didn't eat fish for maybe a month and then went back to eating fish like normal. So, I think that citizen engagement is really important, but then the challenge is to kind of keep people aware. And part of that is what Ms. Manfredi said, like having more knowledge about it and just being able to translate that into everyday people's kind of experiences and languages as well.
Yeah, great. I think it's interesting, a couple of things that people have both touched on, and I saw Dr. Rogers responded about sustainable fisheries and the certification schemes. It's true, we currently do not have ecosystem impact assessments of fishing. So of many of our activities, for mining, for building developments, for port constructions, all kinds of things, there are ecosystem impact assessments of those activities. Fishing, as Dr. Rogers explained, through its many forms and modes and impacts, actually has impacts on all different types of the ecosystem, and they're not currently assessed. And the climate impact is also not currently assessed, and that is a new and developing area, but there is a lot of information that's already available. There's already the carbon richness of seabeds is already mapped all around around Ireland and in Irish seas. So already we can look at how the most carbon rich seabeds of Ireland are being impacted by bottom trawling, for example, and equally, impacts on other parts of the ecosystem and the food web. And I think if the EU could actually apply those things in detail, follow scientific advice, do ecosystem impacts using this action plan, then it makes it easier for consumers, because let's face it, consumers can't ask those questions every single time, or the people who sell them the fish don't know the answers or have the answers, or it's not written on the label. So as much as, having a strong and solid governance system in place, particularly when, governments have made commitments to doing these things, I think is really important and certainly helps get there quicker. So look, it's the end of our hour. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but we got a couple of questions from the live Q&A, and I invite any of the panelists to type your answer into that live chat there. I've asked a couple of them, and we can, of course, also maybe answer some questions and pop them on the web page where we put the recording for the webinar as well. Just really like to thank all of our panelists for your contributions and for the conversation. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and really nice to hear different people's perspectives. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everybody for joining the webinar. We will put a recording online on the Owlfish website and share it with all of the people who registered for the event. So it's exactly on the half hour. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for the invitation and the hosting.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Nice evening to all. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.